I think the closest I have ever come to meeting a genius was Dr. Joe Davis, who was the chief medical examiner of Dade County, Florida. Joe was legendary in his own field. He had charisma. He was down to earth. He was simply one of the nicest, kindest, and most dynamic individuals that ever lived. I arrived at the University of Miami to start the residency in family medicine. That is, in the second year of the residency after switching from McGill the first year in internal medicine. And the chairman of family medicine, Dr. Lynn Carmichael, knowing of my interest in smoking, suggested that I go meet a couple of people. One of them was Charles Tate, a professor of pulmonary medicine at Jackson Memorial Hospital in the University of Miami. And Dr. Tate was a remarkable individual, a true Sunday school teacher who would carry around a set of freeze-dried lungs and be ready to lecture on smoking at the drop of a hat. And Dr. Tate was a lovely man. He was a devoutly religious person, and he was very kind and certainly, he tolerated me. You could tell that our approaches were entirely different, but he was so God-fearing and adamant about the smoking issue that by force of personality, he helped really win the day. He succeeded in getting cigarette machines removed from Jackson Memorial Hospital, where we were practicing. And he also became the chairman of GASP, Group Against Smoking Pollution, and the leader of the referendum in Dade County, the first in the United States to have a ballot on whether to pass a clean indoor air ordinance that would cover public transportation and restaurants and waiting rooms and elevators. And Dr. Tate, known as Frank Tate, was really quite a champion. He never broke character. He was just the same, always very adamant, very forceful speaker, but clearly in the old school mode of doggone it, this stuff is dangerous, it's expensive, it costs us lives, and you could almost think of him as pumping his fist down on that Bible, as he did every Sunday. And when I was on the Larry King Show for that radio debut, so to speak, I brought Dr. Tate, and he provided really the only hour that Larry King really tolerated us, because he was very respectful toward Dr. Tate, whereas me he didn't even pay any attention to, and he practically kicked me off the air when I objected to his smoking. But Tate was universally respected and just a wonderful man. He was president of the Dade County Medical Association, and he also ran for delegate of the American Medical Association House of Delegates, but was defeated by a Dr. Fernandez. And I recall being at the AMA meeting around 1978 and running into Dr. Fernandez and sort of going up to him and introducing myself as I was a fellow at the Journal of American Medical Association at the time. This was 1979, actually. And I congratulated him on his election to the AMA House of Delegates. And I said, it's too bad that both you and Dr. Tate couldn't have gotten elected. And he started ranting against Dr. Tate. Oh, he's with the smoking. That's all he talks about is the smoking. And I said, well, excuse me, Dr. Fernandez, that's my area of interest, and I think Dr. Tate has done a remarkable job, and he's one of my heroes. And I ended the conversation right there. The footnote is that Dr. Fernandez did pass away not that long after from lung cancer. But the other really remarkable individual and probably the only true genius I've ever met is Joe Davis. I've heard that Joe was the basis for Quincy, the show with Jack Klugman about the forensic pathologist who was always solving every kind of mystery imaginable. And Klugman did spend a full year, apparently, at the office of the medical examiner watching Joe, and that's pretty much what I wound up doing when Lynn Carmichael suggested I go over and meet him. I had no idea what Dr. Davis had done in regard to smoking, but it turns out that he had written arguably the very first paper in 1971 in the Florida Medical Association Journal calling for smoking to be listed on death certificates as a cause of death. hard to imagine that wasn't done. But he commented on how all of these tests for newborns were state law, rare diseases that someone had and therefore wanted others not to have. But there was quite an expense to test every baby in the state for what might affect only 1 in 100,000 infants. But Joe contrasted that with the ubiquity of smoking and how it was such a cause of death, but that because it wasn't recorded, the legislators just were not fully aware of the great impact on the economy and on health that smoking caused. So, among other accomplishments, Joe helped us formulate DOC. When I started DOC and had the idea for it, he sat with me and advised me on what to do and not to do. And sure enough, my very first interview with a medical reporter called Bard Lindemann at the Miami Herald had the headline, "Doctors who don't talk about smoking, it's nothing short of malpractice." Well, wouldn't you know it, the Dade County Medical Association was meeting that very night, and I had the distinction of being condemned by the Dade County Medical Association for that headline. Well, no one ever called me and verified whether that was exactly what I had said. I'm not saying it was that different. But Bard picked out probably the most controversial statement and put it as a headline. And Joe came to me and said, instead of railing against physicians and medical societies, who he agreed weren't doing a whole lot on smoking, he said, why don't you really look at what the media are doing? They're in cahoots with the tobacco industry, and look at all of the allies in that they have, even in our own community, and focus on them and use the medical societies as your allies and build their interest. And sure enough, as also a president of the Dade County Medical Association, and certainly still influential, he got me invited to speak at the next meeting of the association. And not only did I get a standing ovation, one of those few that I've ever had, but they even gave me a contribution of $400 for DOC. So Joe was always with us. He became our first honorary chairman. And when we started our house calls on one of them on the Miami Herald, we lined up, I think, 76 nurses, physicians, med students, and others at noon, each with a placard holding up an ad for cigarettes that had appeared in the Miami Herald the previous month. And I think there were 42 cigarette ads that had appeared in the previous month, and we had about 70 posters related to that. And Joe was there. He came to the demonstration. He didn't join us, but he photographed it. So the photographs we have are from Joe Davis supporting us from the audience, so to speak. And this is the way he was. He was never too busy to open his door and let me in. I went on scenes with him to see people who had been found deceased, would go in the autopsy room with him. He introduced me to the consumer advocate of Dade County, Walter Dartland. And Joe was really almost like my stepfather, and he really took that role. He also, as it turns out, was the medical examiner for my own father, who passed away in Miami on vacation. And so I had that connection with Joe all along, and it was reinforced. I reconnected with Joe in the early 2000 teens when I wrote to his daughters, and we had shared stories of Joe. He was quite ill, bedridden, but still with all of his marbles intact. He had lost his eyesight, and he was in bed. And so when I spoke at FSU in Tallahassee, Florida State University, Sam, my son, and I went to visit Joe in his home, beautiful home overlooking the bay there, owned by one of his daughters. We had a wonderful conversation, and he was as feisty and opinionated as ever, a truly great individual, loved every bit of our meetings, and he passed away not long after that, and it's so wonderful that we had the chance to connect and come to just a wonderful closure. So without Joe Davis, we wouldn't have DOC, and we wouldn't have his inspiration still with us today.